Hi, all. So this is the Drambo Buchla Music Easel Simulator. This is a patch I've been working on off and on for, I don't know, probably 3 years. Um, and here it is in all its glory. So I'm going to walk through how this is structured and kind of how you operate it. And I'm going to be referencing the real instrument. And I would really encourage you to spend a little bit of time if you really want to actually use this thing, studying the real instrument, watching some of the explainer videos about how the real instrument operates. You're going to have a much easier time with this if you have some familiarity with the actual Buchla Music Easel. So first off, you can see this is broken down into multiple tracks. The layout of this patch roughly replicates the real instrument, and I did that for a bunch of reasons. But some of you may disagree with that. Some of you may love it. But that's just how I chose to do it. The one thing that doesn't really replicate spatially to the actual instrument is this output section here, the main. This is the equivalent of the right side over here of the real instrument. So you have channel A and B volumes, you have your spring reverb, reverberation. This has a monitor level. I don't replicate that in the real instrument or in my simulation. And then you have master volume. So if you look up here, this component here, this output section, replicates those functions. That flows into an effects chain. This is kind of an all-purpose effects pedal that I built. We're not going to really spend a bunch of time on this here, but for the purposes of this demo and the way you receive the patch, that's disabled here in the mixer, so that you're just getting straight out of the output into just an EQ and then the mixer output. When you tap a key, it's not working. Oh, there we go. So if you tap a key and you want the key to actually register into the instrument, you have to have the CV selected. So if you have any other track selected on the keyboard, this will not work. Now, if you plug a MIDI controller, MIDI keyboard into this, then it'll work all the time. But if you're just using your iPad or, God forbid, your iPhone to operate this, you will have to keep this CV track selected. Okay, and you can see you've got some amps here that are showing when signal is coming through. You'll notice that as you play with this instrument, the master volume gets pegged really easily. I would just suggest ignoring that and just listening to the output. So now we go down into the switches and sliders rows. Okay, so again, in the real instrument, these correspond to these switches you see here highlighted, and then the sliders immediately below them. And the way these are actually structured in the real instrument is that the switches correspond to the sliders immediately below them, and then actually also correspond to the patches below them. So all of this works as a unit. This is the dual low-pass gate. This one is the complex oscillator. So all of these controls that you see are essentially managing that function. Spatially, in the simulator, I wasn't able really to do that because the switches and the sliders, really just the switches, end up being so space consuming that what I had to do was split them onto 2 rows. And so you'll notice here you've got dual low pass gate. This section up here in the switches corresponds to the dual low pass gate sliders down below it. And just to explain kind of what you're seeing here, if you're not familiar with the real instrument, the dual low pass gate is set up. I think its kind of claim to fame is that it is a combination filter and amplifier. There are 2 gates essentially, so there are 2 chains of output. You've got gate 1 here, and these 2 switches here, and then these 2 sliders correspond to that. And then you have gate 2 over here, these switches and these sliders. The way this works is there are 2 oscillators in the instrument, and each one is run kind of by default into one of the 2 low pass gates. The complex oscillators always run into gate 1, and then gate 2 you can actually select an input. So there's a jack, which corresponds to a jack elsewhere that I'll get into later. The mod oscillator, or the second oscillator, is generally what you'll have there. And then the low pass gate 1, this allows you to run the output of low pass gate 1, which is the complex oscillator, into gate 2. And I don't think the simulator replicates that very well. In theory, if you get things balanced right, it can serve almost kind of like as a band pass filter, because the signal from gate 1 is inverted going into gate 2, so you can play with the filter levels. I don't see, or the way I built this, I don't hear much of an effect from doing that, so feel free to play around with it. There are different modes for each gate here. So this is combination. That means that it's applying both an amplifier and a filter at the same time. So as you move the slider up and down, you can hear the filter opening as well as the amp going. If I switched out to filter, then you're just hearing essentially the frequency of the filter, and then amp, you can hear there's no filter on it at all. I tend to just keep these in combination mode, but again, in service of replicating the real instrument, and for those of you who want to be more explorational with this, go knock yourself out. You're also going to see a couple of what I'm calling switches here, these gate mod sources, gate mod source 1 here and 2. This instrument, or the simulation of it, is really hard to patch, especially if you're just experimenting with things and you want to actually perform things and do a little bit of patching while you're performing. Excuse me. Again, in the real instrument, if you scroll down here, these jacks here that are shown under the controls, the black jacks are inputs to the sliders above them, and then the colored jacks on any side of them essentially are different sources that you can patch into that. So what I've done for speed and simplicity is build a couple of quick patch switches, essentially, that allow you to, for each one of the gates, you can quickly patch the envelope, the pulsar. So right now the envelope is being triggered by the keyboard. The pulsar just goes all the time. And then the jack, and there is actually a jack for this down below that I'll get to in a second. The way the dual pass gate works, just in general, is that you've got this level slider, and that sets essentially the lowest volume that gate is going to be at, right? So if you want no volume coming out, you come all the way to the bottom. This other one here, now I can put that into the gate. There's nothing actually, or the jack, and there's nothing actually going into the jack right now. So you can see that doesn't have any effect. But if I turn it to the pulser is kind of like a combination of continuously cycling LFO, and essentially a bunch of things are wired into the pulser. You can hear it's cycling, and I can then bring that level up, and now you're hearing essentially the two things in combination. So this the level 1 or gate 1 is currently wired in, as I said, to the envelope. Now the envelope is being triggered by a key press. So I can turn that up a little bit. And it's not firing very reliably when I'm audio recording here. But so you'll see this pairing of two sliders throughout the instrument. And again, just always think of it as the right slider sets kind of the bass level, and then the left one is essentially for rhythmic or tonal or kind of temporal changes that you might want to apply. So that's the gate. So these two, LPG1 and is wired into the mixer A output. LPG2 is wired into B. Okay, so I can raise the level here and then turn it up or down and do the same thing with B. So that's the low pass gate. Now we're going to get into the oscillators, and I'm going to kind of cover both of these a little bit at the same time. Again, I'm going to jump back over here into the real instrument. There are a number of controls here up in the switchers. You've got these 4 sliders, and then you have, of course, again, the patches. As you receive it, the pitch is up at, I believe it's 50%. Yep, it's at 50%, so it's halfway up. If you bring that up, you can actually change the pitch there. I tend to just kind of leave this one halfway, but you can mess with it however you want. And then there's a pitch CV. Okay, so this is just like the low pass gate. That represents this pitch CV represents a way to modify the pitch. So in the case right here, if we look up at the switches, the keyboard is on. Okay, so that means right here, keyboard is on. That means that the keyboard will affect the pitch. I can turn that off, and you'll hear that there's still an effect, and that's because the second switch here, which again is one of, it's not from the real instrument. This is kind of a quick patch, but there are a couple of different sources here. You can use the sequencer, the PVS or preset voltage source, and then the jack, and there's a jack down below. So we'll just leave that like that for now. There's a polarity, so this takes the CV in from the keyboard or wherever else and inverts it. Okay, so you can see here, that means that as you play higher on the keyboard, it's actually sending a lower voltage and vice versa. Okay, not so useful on the keyboard probably necessarily, but can be very useful if you're doing things with the sequencer or the random sources, things of that nature. Fine tune. So this is obviously this pitch slider here, pretty coarse. If you're close, you can use this, and it's only the whole thing is only a cent or about a cent. So this is largely quantized. The instrument, again, the real thing is not. But I find with Drambo, it's just so difficult to set these sliders and knobs to get things in perfect tune that I actually end up using the fine tune a lot. On the complex oscillator, you've got 3 different wave shapes. As I switch through them, you notice that nothing is changing, right? Nothing is happening. Okay? That's because this knob wave shape blend here is used to mix between whatever shape is selected here that ends up at the far right of this and a sine wave. So the far right is the spike, far left is a sine. We've got far right is a square and a triangle, okay? And then we can blend between those two using this knob, okay? So the spike, these oscillator shapes, I went and found, I don't know, a 13 or 14-year-old series of videos on YouTube of someone who had hooked up a real easel to an oscilloscope. And so essentially I cloned these waves. So the spike is this, I don't know, really unique waveform that the Buchla oscillator generates. The square is not a perfect square, so there's some more harmonic stuff going on in there. All of that, again, is replicated here. The other thing about the complex oscillator is you have these timbres, and essentially this is a wave folder. So we can go through and wave fold, and then we'll have also the mod CV. So I'll put that on the pulsar so that you can hear it cycling. Okay. So the thing to note is that the timbre only affects the sine wave. Well, actually, I should say that. It only affects the sine wave on the far left, and then it also affects the triangle wave on the far right. So you can hear here, they're subtly different, the triangle and the sine wave. So that's timbre. And that, again, this timbre CV, mod CV, you have a quick patch switch right there for that. Let's move on to the mod oscillator. These are all of the controls. And then this is the sliders that correspond. Again, we have keyboard in and out or off and on. Let me turn this up. You can hear it. This is obviously set lower. With that frequency slider, again, you have the frequency CV source here. This is set to, I'll set that to sequencer, and then it's actually getting it much lower because the sequencer is all down at the bottom. Leave that there. The mod oscillator has 2 ranges. So this low range here is inaudible and until you get it all the way up. Before I move this. the very top of the slider, then it becomes audible. And the original instrument, the early 1970s instrument, actually this was only low. The CBS reissue that came out whenever it came out added this high range. So we'll just set this back here, 909. So that's the way this works. You have your fine tune knob. Then you have the mod CV and modulation. So the reason this is called the mod oscillator is that it can be used to modify the complex oscillator. So what I mean by that is, let's turn this all the way down, and I'll turn the complex oscillator back up here on on gate 1, and when I pull this knob, the mod slider, what's happening here is using the modulation switch, it's selected to FM, so whatever the frequency of the modulation oscillator is being FM'd into the complex oscillator, and that also can be CV controlled. Okay, so we have FM, we have AM, and then there's also an external in. The way this wire is wired to you by default is there's a noise source. So you can mix noise, you can mix noise rhythmically in using the mod CV. And these, of course, can be used in combination with timbre to get some pretty cool tones. Okay. I'll turn this off here. From here, let's go to the pulsar here. These two sliders, and then up in here, these are the switches. Okay, so the way this, as I said before, this is kind of a combination of a simple LFO, a gate source, and an envelope. And right now it's self-cycling. You can see I put the signal amp here so that you can kind of see what it's doing. This, by the way, stops moving if you're moving the instrument. So if you're looking for it and it's frozen, that's probably what's going on. It has 3 trigger sources. There's key, which means now if I tap the keyboard, it triggers then. There's self, which means it's self-cycling. And then the sequence, it can actually get pulses from the sequencer, and I'll actually probably just leave it there for now. Well, maybe I won't. The other switch is this mode. Trig means that it's triggered from the trigger. Off means that it's not being triggered by the trigger. And then once triggers at one time. In the real instrument, this off once switch is spring loaded, so you can just flip it down and then it pops back up. Obviously, well, or maybe not obviously, I can't figure out how to do that in Drambo. So this is just a switch, but I do have a MIDI thing that kind of replicates that. Move on to the envelope. Looking here at the switches. Oh, and actually, let me go back to the pulsar. you'll see this period mod in here, and what this does, there's a jack down below that I'll show you in a second, that allows you to modify the period when it's say when it's in self-triggering mode. You can use other CV sources to speed up or slow down the pulsar. And so one example of that is that you might actually want to use, say, the sequencer, set different values here, and then send that CV into the period mod, and as the sequencer is cycling, your pulsar will actually speed up and slow down. So that's an example of that. Turn this off. We have the envelope. Okay, so we have, again, the triggers can be the keyboard. We have the pulsar there, and then the sequencer, and again, I'll touch on that in a second. Then we have three modes. We have transient, so let me turn it on here. So when I tap the key, whether I hold it down or not, it goes and then it cycles through. And sustain, when I hold the key down, it stays open. And then self, what this does is it actually, as soon as it ends the decay cycle, it jumps all the way back to the attack. And so you can get essentially another LFO-like thing going here. This is one of the areas where the real instrument, which I've replicated here, works a little bit backwards to what you would expect. You would normally think that all of these all the way down are going to be the fastest attack. It's actually the opposite. So I think Don equated high and fast. So fast or short is at the very top, and then as you move it down, things get longer. So this, I'll just turn this up here and make sure that's the envelope. Okay, so we have a very short attack, very short sustain, and a little bit of decay. So you can hear this is kind of slowing everything down. This doesn't have any effect. This is staying in the self mode here. Let me turn this on pulsar. So you can kind of see. So again, you actually, the sustain is up, shorter, getting into decay. So that is the envelope. Turn this down. And then we come to the sequencer. So I tried for a long time to use the advanced sequencer in Drambo to drive this instrument. And it was incredibly frustrating, actually, especially with the 2.0 release. Not saying that Drambo is bad. Obviously, it's an amazing tool. But when you're trying to replicate something that was built with rope and string and sticks and things of the early 70s, it is actually kind of almost too advanced. So I went ahead and built a sequencer that replicates the real instrument. So the way this works, you have a trigger, just like for the other things. I'll put that to the pulsar. You can see the signal here. This is showing what stage or gate, I guess what stage it's on at any given moment. Let me go ahead and put this up on the complex oscillator. So I'll come back over here that to sequence. So you can see the higher I send that, the wider it goes. I can put it down low and it just very barely affects it. So I'll put it kind of in the middle here at 50. I don't know. And then let's come back over here. And so I can obviously go through and choose what the frequencies are for my various stages. This can be really touchy, as you might imagine. So if I get close, there is no fine tune. So I will just double tap on the slider and change it manually. You can select the number of stages. So 3, 4, and 5. And then this pulse sequence here, let's go here and do sequence. All right. So I'm going to turn these off, and the sequencer is now firing the envelope, and you can see it's only firing on the first stage. I can change it to fire on the first and fourth now, or third. So it might be easier to hear if we go like this. Shorten this up so you hear just the stages that are turned on, because what I did was I came back over to the low pass gate. I turned the bass level all the way down. I turned the mod up about halfway, and then up here in the gate, the mod source, I selected the envelope. So scroll back here, scroll back here. So I can turn on different stages. And then, of course, you can have it triggered also by the keyboard. Okay, so that's the switches and sliders row. Then we come down to the CV row. So this here, the CV row, replicates really primarily the controls here above the keyboard, but also I've got these patches in here and that little switch there, that random voltage switch. All of that resides here in this row. Oh, and I guess I crashed. Let's open this up again. So you have portamento. And let's turn that up a little bit. This goes pretty long. I'm pretty sure in the real instrument it also goes pretty long. I find, if you want just a subtle amount, you really have to be down in the low tenths. There's an arpeggiator. So turn this off and turn it up to ascending. And I'll put so you can hear the arpeggiator, the rate here. You can hear it better with this also goes quite slow. for a second. Then we come to the preset voltage source. Okay, so what this is, again, this replicates, come over here, this part of the instrument. Okay, so what we have here is there's this switch which says octaves, presets, and none. There's an output jack. And then there are four knobs, and then down below there are 4 white buttons. Okay, and what this does is, well, it does actually a bunch of different things. But what this first switch does is it makes it an octave switch. Okay, and so the way these knobs here correspond, 1, 2, 3, 4, they correspond to the buttons here. But in the octaves mode, these knobs have no effect. Okay. All this is doing is, it says add to main. What that means is that it's actually just adding to the keyboard CV. So if you come up to the, say, modulate, or actually let's do the complex oscillator, you don't have to patch this in the pitch CV source here. Now I can have the sequencer affecting it, but because it says add to main, because it's built right into the keyboard signal itself. You can switch it to preset. If you listen closely, you can hear that this also is quantized. You can turn that stuff off, and I'll show you how to do that if you really want, but that's buried down in the guts of all this CV logic here. So this is kind of a great way to split is essentially the 2 oscillators and control the 2 separately. So right now, this is set to control or to affect the keyboard. So if I go here, all right, so the keyboard and the PVS are interacting. But if I switch this to none, then it doesn't matter what I do. Okay, the keyboard continues to operate, but the preset voltage source is now independent. So what that allows me to do here is, let's go up here to the mod oscillator. I'm going to turn the keyboard off, and I'm going to set the frequency CV source to PVS, and then I'm going to bring the CVS, or the frequency CV, up here. Let's raise the frequency a little bit so you can hear it. And now, as I change this, I can control that independently, but the keyboard is now affecting the complex oscillator. Okay? So no keyboard. That's the complex oscillator. So that's how you split, or that's one way that you can split the 2 oscillators and play them both simultaneously and do harmonies. Really powerful control. I wish I was able to make these buttons larger, because I actually, when I'm playing with this, I use this all the time. Random voltage, there are 5 random voltage sources on the real instrument, and I've kind of, again, tried to replicate them here in the instrument that I'll show down in the patches here. But this switch chooses the trigger that changes the random. So most often, let's patch this in, I'll just choose one here. You can see, the pulsar is now causing the, see, there's the pulsar up there. So it's moving in time with the pulsar. If I switch that to the keyboard, now it's just the keyboard. If I select sequence, this corresponds to these gate buttons here. So let's just turn this on here. And I'm going to leave the audio down, but you can see I've turned just 1 and 4 on. And now you can see it's only changing when those switches hit. Let's see, turn that off, disconnect. So that's a random voltage source trigger. Buried in here, this is ARP logic. You shouldn't have to mess with this, but I've included a latch for the arpeggiator here. Let's see, get this guy up here. So this, if you're playing on an iPad, this can be kind of a pain. So if you want to latch the 2 notes, you can do that. But the real instrument doesn't have a latch, so I turn it off and hide it. All right, and then we have the jacks. We have the keyboard CV out. This is the MIDI source that is coming from the track. This breaks out velocity, gate, and your actual note. We have 2 patch row feedback. These are feedback receives that are coming from the very back end of this patches row. Because the way Drambo works, signals flow from the top to the bottom, not ever from the bottom to the top. And so if you want to take something that is residing down here on this patch bay and send it up into the CV, you have to do that by patching these feedback. Thanks. So I put a couple of here. You've got key pulse. So these are the CV inputs here. You have the pulse in, you have pressure in, and pitch in. Pulse is obviously coming the gate signal from the MIDI keyboard. Pressure is mapped to velocity, and then pitch is obviously pitch. The way the pressure works is if you come into the Drambo keyboard, make sure you've got velocity turned on. We'll come down here. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I'm going to put this oscilloscope into key pressure. These are where the outputs come in. These up here are the inputs, and then the outputs are down here. The way this works with pressure is you can kind of see, oh, I've got the ARP turned on. Turn that off. You can see as I tap higher or lower on the key, the pressure is higher or lower. Okay. Typically, the way I use this with the keyboard is I'll put C2 here on the very left edge, and then I lock it. And this allows me to actually swipe my fingers around on the keyboard. Unfortunately, the pressure or the velocity doesn't change as I'm holding my finger on. That's one thing that is very poorly replicated in this simulator is pressure. But anyway, that is a CV source that you can play with. Then we have port CV in, ARP CV in. Port CV in is the portamento, ARP is the arpeggiator. Essentially what these allow you to do is, say we could put, I don't know, let's put the envelope. We'll put the envelope into patch row feedback 2. Where did that go? Envelope. And then we'll set the envelope to self-cycle. And slow it down a little bit. So you can see it self-cycling there. I can now take that and put it into portamento. And what that will do, turn low pass gate on. You can hear that the portamento is getting faster and slower on a CV. So that's the way that works. I'm not going to kind of go into a ton of depth on it right here. But you will need to disconnect that. Otherwise, things are going to be super wonky and you're not going to realize why. ARP is the same way. Both, by the way, these inputs don't disable these. They don't disable these knobs here. They interact. I don't know how it works in the real instrument, but that's how I wired it up in this simulator. And then finally, I mentioned the pulsar, this period mod in here, where you can speed up or slow down the pulsar. This is the jack for that. Okay, so one of the ways this gets used, I'll just put this in. I have patched, by default, random 3 is patched into patch row feedback 1. And then I have patch row feedback 1 into the pulse here. So random 3 is, I'll just show you what it is on the oscilloscope. This is a random negative voltage. And it's actually right now it's being triggered by the pulsar itself. And when I come in here, maybe I'll just turn this up. You can see this is low pass gate 2 is being triggered by the pulsar. As I raise the mod in, you can see that random voltage is speeding up or slowing down the pulsar. Okay. This is a negative voltage. This random here, which serves to speed that up. Again, you have to kind of think everything is reversed in Buchla world. Last here on the CV row is the logic. I'm not going to get into this. This is all the guts of all of the stuff. Basically, everything that we've looked at heretofore are just remote controls for things that reside either down in this CV logic area or down in the oscillators and low pass gate. There's a ton of interest from people. Maybe I'll go and do a Drambo builder tour of this, but for now I'm just going to focus on actually how to operate it. Last thing is the patch row. The way this is set up, you actually don't really need to use this until you want to get experimental. But here it is, and I'll explain what it is and what some of this stuff is set up to do. So this, you've got CV outputs. I think this has actually got broken. Key pitch. Okay. So we have CV outputs, right? So we have key, which is the pitch. We have key pressure. Um, we have the CV of the arpeggiator itself. We have the preset voltage control, portamento, sequencer, envelope. These are all outputs, or essentially CV, kind of continuous CV. Then we have gate outputs. These are things that can essentially um, trigger other things, I guess, to say it that way. Um, so we have, again, the keyboard. That's the keyboard gate. We have the arpeggiator gate separate from the key gate if you wanted to split that out. Let's see, and that also is broken. I will fix this before, or oops, no, we need the pulse. Um, and then the sequencer gate here, again, just reminds you, corresponds with these switches up here. Okay. Then we have some utility outputs. This is where I put the randoms. The randoms are all different. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As I understand it, they are also different in the real instrument. So I've kind of tried to replicate what I can glean about that. Random 1, it goes both positive and negative, full kind of cycle. Random 2 is just an inversion of 1. So if you want to push, I don't know, random 1 to one oscillator, you can send random 2 to the other oscillator, and then they will play opposite of each other. Random 3 takes random 1, but pushes it all down into negative voltage. Again, I found this was helpful because some things like the pulsar respond maybe a little bit better to negative voltage. Random 4 is all positive. And then random 5 limits the CV change to a very small range, right around 0. And I found that's really useful if I want to just provide a little bit of subtle randomness to the pitch of, say, an oscillator. We have an inverter here so that you can invert any of these signals. And then we have a noise source. The real instrument doesn't include a noise source. I think maybe the easel command does now in certain circumstances, but I just leave that there because it's handy. We have an oscilloscope so you can check out and interrogate any of these signals. And then we have the inputs. So this is the modulation oscillator inputs. These, again, correspond when you're up in here. Let's go to the modulation oscillator. When you see these, say, frequency CV source, when you see something labeled jack, so we'll put these into jack. We've got the mod CV source here. Mod CV, mod in corresponds to that. We have the frequency CV, and that corresponds here to the frequency in. And again, these are things that are selected, and then you modify them with these mod or these kind of CV sliders that reside right next to the bass level. The complex oscillator, you've got a pitch in, and then timbre, and then the low pass gate. You have your mod ins for 1 and 2, and then you also have this jack that allows you to plug other sources into gate 2 as an actual source. We have our feedback sends here. I will mention all the way up here at the top, I didn't touch on this to start with, there's an external audio input. And so what I will sometimes play around with, this by default is actually the microphone of the instrument. Of your iPad or of your iPhone. And so you can do things like patch this in to, say, low pass gate 2, and it's actually going to pass the mic of your iOS device into the instrument, and you can do goofy things with it. So that's a basic tour. I'll post a few other videos showing this in actual performance. But hit me up with questions, comments, and I will answer as I can. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy.